It was 2004. I was volunteering at San Francisco's Queer Film Festival, and I decided to go to a screening at the Castro Theater where I saw a movie that would occupy my thoughts for the next 20 years. The film was called Straitjacket. It was made to look like an old Rock Hudson Doris Day rom-com from the 1950s, and at first glance, you might even mistake it for a classic film, until the leading man falls in love with another guy. This film had everything I loved. Smart jokes, a powerful message, tasteful titillation, and a musical number. I loved it. The audience loved it. We gave the director a standing ovation. It felt like the debut of a new camp classic. But after its big opening, Straitjacket disappeared. You couldn't find it in theaters, on TV, in rental stores, even the one where I worked. When I told people about Straitjacket, nobody had ever heard of it. It was like it never existed. So for years, I wondered, why did such a great movie just vanish? Was it really as good as we thought that night at the Castro? But now, 20 years after Straitjacket came and went, we have some answers. I talked to the director, and he opened up about behind-the-scenes battles with Hollywood executives. I talked to the actors, who had stories of their own, and I found a legal trail involving tens of millions of dollars in alleged fraud. This is a story of Straitjacket, the struggle to get it made, why it mysteriously vanished, and how a mid-century gay romance is poised for a triumphant return. Before that 2004 screening, all I knew about Straitjacket was that it was written and directed by Richard Day. I appreciated Richard's work because I recognized his name from The Gary Shandling Show, Mad About You, Drew Carey, Spin City, and lots more. His shows often had queer characters, even in the early 90s, when there were very few of those to be found on TV. Richard had also taken some wild swings with lesser-known shows, like Whoops, a sitcom about the end of the world that wasn't a hit.
We're gonna need a lot more stuffing.
So I had a feeling, with Straitjacket, I was in for something good. Straitjacket is set in 1953. We meet Guy Stone, a famous movie star, beloved by moviegoers everywhere.
I always say without my fans, I'd be no better than they are.
But what the public doesn't know is where Guy's affections lie.
I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names.
From the start, the movie has a lot of fun with Guy living a double life, setting up lots of great jokes.
No, I gotta get to work, but here's my number. I hope you'll use it.
Oh, of course I will. What do you think you are, some stranger I just picked up off the street?
Well,
at least I didn't have to tell him how to get here.
And references to real-life 50s celebrities.
Oh, I need a little pick-me-up. Which one of these is Judy's?
And if Straitjacket was just 90 minutes of A-plus comedy, that would be great. But as the movie unspools, something deeper starts to appear behind the gags. For all the laughs, Guy's life is a bit tragic. It's the 1950s. There's intense social stigma around anything perceived as queer. So Guy has to sneak around and hide the fact that he's gay. Despite having wealth and fame and power, there's one thing he still can't have: the freedom to live openly and honestly. Because if people find out about the real him, it would mean the end of his career. Or worse. That's kind of dark for a zany comedy, but I like that the movie doesn't shy away from the reality of the time in which it's set, and the loneliness that often entailed. Early in the film, we see Guy sneak into one of the secret underground gay bars that existed back then. It's in a bad part of town with no sign, no windows. Pretty accurate to how those places looked in real life. Of course, you have to be careful about who saw you go into a place like this. But one night, Guy gets a little careless. He doesn't realize that he's being followed to the bar by another actor named Freddie, who's jealous of Guy's success and wants to take him down. Freddie tips off the cops.
near a bar at the corner of Hyperion and Rowena. Perverts are swarming the place, and I'm worried for our children. Fine, then I'm worried for our hookers. You coming or not?
And we get another accurate depiction of queer life in the 1950s, a police raid. Freddie photographs Guy as he's arrested, threatens to leak the photos to the press. Guy's agent tells him his career is finished unless they can pull off some kind of miracle, and so they start cooking up a scheme.
What if he got married?
Married? First of all, marry who? Because I promise you, any two-bit starlet will stab us in the back.
Fruit?
It's a pretty remarkable premise for the time. Back in 2004, you very seldom saw entertainment acknowledge the harsh realities of mid-century queer life, especially in a bright, colorful comedy. But Straitjacket isn't just about how things used to be. The setting's the 1950s, but it's using that history to comment on how Hollywood's attitude towards homosexuality really hadn't changed that much, a subject that was very much on the mind of writer-director Richard Day. As a young TV writer, Richard kept his sexuality secret.
In '87, I got my first job, and I told them I wasn't gay. I got asked in the interview, And I didn't ever really correct people.
That worried him, and in the early 90s, he came out. But he discovered that working as an openly gay writer in Hollywood came with a new set of problems.
It's not that anybody's calling you names. They're very pleasant to your face. It's just that you are less than them. You have less power than them. In any conflict, you will lose that conflict. It's like every day you go in and you put on your armor and you just hope you don't get emotionally devastated that day.
By the mid-90s, Richard had worked his way up through the industry thanks to a mix of talent and determination. But he sometimes butted heads with TV executives, especially when he wanted gay characters in his episodes. At the time, most TV executives assumed audiences would never accept a gay character.
There was a lot of anger in me then probably building up about being gay in Hollywood and how it's not fair.
And Richard didn't have an outlet for that frustration. Until 1999, when he moved to New York to work on the sitcom Spin City, and he saw an opportunity in off-Broadway theater.
I was going to all of these plays and the comedy plays in New York, and the writing wasn't all that good. I was thinking well, these jokes wouldn't make it past a Wednesday run through.
So he thought,
it's not as intimidating as I thought it was. I'll put on a play while I'm here. This is very stupid thinking, but I did it.
Between his work on episodes of Spin City, Richard started cooking up an exciting new project. And you can cook up an exciting project of your own thanks to this video's sponsor, HelloFresh. My favorite time of day is night, because that's when I get to whip up a fresh dinner from scratch, and then sit down and watch a movie. Dinner and a show. But when my schedule's too jam-packed to pick out a recipe, go shopping, figure out portions, it's nice to know HelloFresh will deliver fresh ingredients right to your door. Every week, they offer more than 45 quick and easy dinner options, including some that take as little as 15 minutes to prepare. You can pick exactly the meal you want, or you can let them choose so there's a pleasant surprise when you open the box. Either way, there's tons of options so you'll never get bored. Plus, new members who sign up with the code POGBAUMFREE will get a free breakfast item with every HelloFresh delivery. Their latest box had a recipe for pork chops with balsamic rosemary sauce, garlic bread, and roasted broccoli. It was super easy to make, and although my partner and I were planning to save some for leftovers, we wound up eating the whole thing in one sitting because it was just so good. Click the link in the description or use my code to get free breakfast for life. One breakfast item per box while subscription is active. Now, let's get back to Richard Day, who was just about to start writing his first off-Broadway play. If Hollywood didn't want gay stories, he figured, he'd tell a story without them. And not just any story, one that commented on the industry homophobia that was driving him crazy. Richard had always been a fan of those classic 1950s rom-coms, and he started kicking around an intriguing premise. What if Rock Hudson's life story was told as though it was a Rock Hudson film? And that was a brilliant idea for a couple of reasons. If you're not familiar with Rock Hudson, here's a quick recap. Rock was an actor who starred in romantic dramas in the 1950s and then romantic comedies in the 1960s. Throughout his career, Rock frequently played men who pretend to be someone they're not, usually to trick a woman into falling in love with them. For example, in one film he plays a suave songwriter who flirts with a woman by pretending to be a shy tourist. In another he plays a cocky ad executive who lures a woman in by pretending to be a virginal scientist. Rock's characters only ever intend to lead the women on, but then he unexpectedly falls in real love with them, the truth is revealed, and they live happily ever after. The lie leads to love. It's a weird theme for an actor to build his brand around, but it also was oddly fitting in Rock's case. Because in real life, he was also pretending to be something he was not, heterosexual. Rock would go on fake dates with starlets, he gave interviews about his ideal woman, he even got married to his agent's secretary, all the while secretly dating and falling in love with men. Richard had found it fascinating that Rock reflected popular 50s ideals of the perfect man.
And the whole time he's going home and as a boyfriend, that is funny.
That provided some fertile inspiration for a play about Richard's own experiences as a gay man in Hollywood. And by the way, if you want to know more about Rock, I've got a whole separate video about him on my channel. Richard got to work hashing out the plot for a play. It was liberating not having to run his ideas by TV executives who'd gotten in his way for years.
They had all the power. You could not get your gay stuff out. There was no outlet for it at all unless you made the outlet yourself. And that's what I just ended up doing, I guess.
He borrowed a few real-life details from Rock Hudson's life. His main character would be an actor named Guy Stone, who's handsome, successful, and closeted. Like Rock Hudson, Guy's career is threatened when someone tries to out him. And also like Rock, Guy's agent tries to cover up the homosexuality by arranging a marriage. In Rock's case, it was to his agent's secretary, and in Richard's play, Guy's agent fixes him up with a naive studio secretary named Sally, who had always worshipped Guy from afar. So far, this premise matches a lot of Rock Hudson films. Typically, the next beat would be that they fall in love. But that's where Richard gave his story a twist. In Straight Jacket, Guy does lie to a woman to lure her into a marriage, and then he does fall unexpectedly in love. But not with the leading lady. Instead, he meets a writer and falls in love with him. Now, instead of the lie leading to love, it's getting in the way. And Guy has to decide whether the safety of the lie is worth turning his back on the man he loves. Richard found a group of talented actors for his play, including a young comic actor named Carrie Preston, who'd graduated a few years earlier from Juilliard. When she got the script,
I just fell in love with it, and I thought, oh, this could be really fun.
Carrie would play Sally, the studio secretary who doesn't realize she's being roped into marrying a gay man. It would have been easy to make the Sally character a simple caricature, but Carrie was excited to give her more depth.
I'm really proud of the arc that we got to tell for this woman, because a lot of times, she's just the wife, or, I was very careful to make sure this wasn't a, girls are icky kind of thing that can sometimes happen,
Carrie brought a lot of emotion to the role, and also a fun end of Act 1 musical number. But not everyone in the cast was having such a good time. Richard had written a gay butler character and was starting to regret it. The butler had a lot of funny lines, but didn't do much to advance the plot. And halfway into rehearsals, Richard decided to just cut the character. It was the kind of quick cast change that happens all the time on sitcoms. No big deal. But
it wasn't what we were used to in the theater, so it was a little shocking. We were like, what?
Then came another swerve. Richard wanted to stage the play in Greenwich Village, but theaters there weren't interested. He found an available space at an off-Broadway theater called Playhouse 91, which until recently was home to Jewish repertory theater. It was also pretty out of the way, not an area known for theaters and not close to a subway stop.
And so, we knew that it was maybe not the best place for this play.
And there were still bigger problems, like no ending. Richard couldn't figure out how the story should end, and he kept writing and rewriting, which meant the cast kept having to learn new versions before each rehearsal. It's not totally unusual for a new play to do something like that. Often a production will start with tryouts in other cities, where it's cheaper and there's less scrutiny from critics. They'll fix whatever's not working, and then they'll come to New York once it's polished. But Richard wasn't familiar with that system. He'd committed to starting in New York, where the audiences were way more demanding than anywhere else. The closest they could get to doing a roadshow was to hold previews, basically giving away tickets to get audiences in the door to see how they reacted. Those early previews went okay, they were able to fill the house and audiences seemed happy. But then again, the tickets were free, and as opening night drew near, the cast and crew were getting nervous. Would audiences embrace a gay love story set in the 1950s?
I'll never forget the first night of the show. The lights come up and it's two shirtless guys in bed together. And I hear this woman go, "You want to leave now?"
So the opening night audience might have been caught off guard by the subject matter. But what would the critics think?
Couldn't have gone worse, I suppose. I mean, just in terms of how it was received by the critics, which is everything there.
Critics called the play too quippy, too sitcom-y. They didn't get the story. They didn't think there was any message. The critic for the New York Times went for the jugular and said the problem was with Richard specifically. Audiences heard those reviews loud and clear. And although the theater was filled for previews, after the reviews came out, when the curtain went up the next night, there were only about 5 people in the entire audience. They finished out the first week playing to a nearly empty room, and then closed for good. The failure of the play stung. It was the kind of disappointment that would have discouraged a lot of people from mounting another creative project again. But Richard managed to salvage at least one thing from the experience.
But then the play let me know I could do this, and that led me to Girls Will Be Girls.
Girls will be girls, girls will be girls.
It was a pilot script for a TV series written to be a parody of 70s melodramas. It was about 3 actresses who are constantly at each other's throats. The twist was that all of the women would be played by drag queens. It was a bold, weird idea, and at first it looked like he might actually get to make it. An executive Showtime was interested.
Well, I think it's showtime.
But before it could get made, he had to get a green light from the development team, who had the power to approve or deny any new show. And they hated it.
It stinks.
They weren't as familiar with drag. They didn't get the jokes. They were sure audiences would never watch a show about drag queens, and they just turned it down. Once again, Richard decided if the Hollywood system didn't want to make his kind of stories, he'd do it himself. Not as a TV series, but as an independent film. Richard and his friends shot Girls Will Be Girls with a meager budget that they pulled together out of their own pockets. The film is deeply strange. It's played like a serious drama, but loaded with campy drag.
What do you think about the idea of having a dog in the house?
I'm sorry. Have I been staring?
Silly gags, and jokes that would never in a million years fly on network TV.
That's your big secret? An abortion?
Have you had one?
Coco, I've had more children pulled out of me than a burning orphanage.
And when it was done, Richard had no idea what to do with it. He figured he'd show it at a few film fests, hopefully make some of his friends laugh, and that'll be it. Richard sent Girls Will Be Girls to a couple of film festivals. Some weeks passed, and then out of the blue, he got a phone call from someone at a movie distribution company, asking if Girls Will Be Girls had a distributor yet. Richard couldn't figure out how they'd even heard of it, and that's when the person told him it was on the list of movies that had just been accepted into Sundance, the most prestigious film festival in the country. In those days, that was basically a golden ticket. When Girls Will Be Girls made its Sundance debut, companies scrambled to get the rights. IFC won a bidding war, and soon the movie was being shown internationally. For the next year, Richard spent every weekend flying to different cities around the world to show it at various festivals. When the Showtime executives had passed on Girls Will Be Girls, it seemed like a dead end. But ultimately, that might have been for the best. Making it independently allowed Richard to make exactly the movie he wanted, with no one looking over his shoulder and telling him how to change it. And when Girls Will Be Girls succeeded, it was clear the credit belonged to him and the team that he'd brought together. That was huge validation. Proof that there was an audience for the stories he wanted to tell. And with his confidence renewed, Richard figured it might be time to revisit a project close to his heart.
I want to do another one right away. What do I have? Oh, Straight Jacket.
Richard started revising the script for Straight Jacket. He punched up some jokes, put the butler back in, wrote yet another ending that hopefully this time would work. And the more he wrote, the more optimistic he felt.
I had illusions in the early days of the first screenplay that this is going to be a blockbuster and everyone will like it because it's got straight people in it and everybody is fine with this now.
Next, he tried to find some prominent film actors who'd be interested. But when he sent it to agents,
they all had the same thing, basically. He's already played gay.
At the time, major actors might play gay characters once for prestige, but never twice, because that might lead to speculation that they could actually be gay in real life. And for an actor in the early 2000s, that had to be avoided at all costs. And that was a problem, because this was a period piece and would be a lot more expensive than Girls Will Be Girls, hundreds of thousands of dollars. To assemble that kind of budget, indie films would often raise money from investors. But investors were skeptical. They only wanted to get involved if there was a bankable star attached.
People were not offended, but they were just like, why are you sending this to us? It was this era where studios did not do gay films at all.
Despite the success of Girls Will Be Girls, the industry still didn't have a place for a gay love story. The people who decided what movies get made and by who just didn't see a place in the market for it. That was frustrating, but Richard had been told no before. And since Girls Will Be Girls had turned a bit of a profit, he decided he'd use that money to make Straight Jacket himself.
That's where that money came from, was just me spending my own money to get my voice, or just a gay voice, out there.
Spending his own money was a risk, of course, but it also meant that he could make exactly the film that he wanted. He started by bringing back some of the cast from the play, including Carrie Preston.
It was thrilling for me, when Richard called, he was like, hey, I'm going to do the movie in the park's yours. I mean, that just doesn't happen that much.
And he brought on some great character actors. To play the agent, he hired Veronica Cartwright, who'd been working in film and TV since she was a child. She was in The Birds, in Alien. She even played Jack's mom on Will and Grace.
Hot dish coming through, and she's carrying a casserole.
To play a studio prop master, he hired Tom Lenk, who you might know as Andrew from Buffy.
Come with me now.
And playing Guy's jealous rival Freddy was Jack Plotnick, a comic actor from a million movies and shows. He played a nervous reporter seduced by Ian McKellen. He was Xander the Elf. He was half of a gay couple on Ellen. Jack shared a lot of Richard's frustrations about being openly gay in Hollywood.
I was usually the only, at least out gay person on set. There was always a question on set of, am I supposed to like if people would make a gay joke right in front of me, it was like, well, do I say I'm gay? There was that sort of pressure of like, when do you tell people? Do I tell people? Do people want to know?
And rounding out the cast were some actors who were then unknown, but just on the cusp of breaking out. Like Michael Emerson, who would go on to star on Lost, Eric Stonestreet just before he appeared on Modern Family, and Matt Lesher, who's now the Reverse Flash in the DC universe. The film has a similar setup to the play. Guy Stone is a famous actor in the 1950s who's secretly closeted. A rival threatens to expose him, so Guy's agent arranges a sham marriage to a studio secretary named Sally. The scene where this premise is set up was the very first one that they shot, and they really jumped into the deep end, because Richard decided to shoot the whole 10-minute scene in one take.
It was just electrifying. First of all, it was our first day, so we were being shot out of a cannon. We were so stoked. We were so excited.
It's an incredibly complex scene with carefully choreographed entrances and exits, jokes that needed perfect timing, even visual effects.
So it was really trial by fire. And as the take would go on, when you start getting into minute 7, minute 8, and you've got to nail this physical comedy, it would just, the pressure would get higher and higher. And when we got it, which I think was maybe the 5th time, everyone was cheering.
The finished scene is pretty impressive. 10 uninterrupted minutes, the same length as the lengthy takes in Alfred Hitchcock's film Rope. That first day set a tone for a fast, chaotic, and very fun series of shoots. In the movie, once Guy and Sally get married, Sally is delighted. Marrying a screen idol seems like a fantasy come true. But Guy is miserable.
Ooh, you slept with her? What was it like?
Terrible. She's a total bottom.
Trying to get out of the house, Guy heads over to the studio. And that's when he meets someone new. A playwright from New York named Rick, whose play is being adapted into a film. Guy befriends him and talks him into sticking around to do some rewrites.
Maybe we can get Mr. Foster here to make the changes. After all, we could always use a fresh set of green eyes.
While also dropping a few hints to see if he's,
Would you like something to drink? Splash of Moet?
Got a beer?
Would you like a glass?
Please.
Like a lot of gay men at the time, Guy's careful to only hint at being gay, using innuendo. Because it was so dangerous to be found out, gay men were often pretty limited in how they could talk about themselves, even to each other, so they used shorthand, signals.
I think Judy Garland's great, don't you?
Am I made of stone?
But Rick, like any good writer, cuts right to the chase.
You could just ask.
Ask what?
If I'm gay?
He's a playwright. He's accustomed to working on his own, independently. And that gives him the freedom to be honest about who he is. And together, Rick and Guy discover being this direct, this honest with another person, coming right out and saying who you are, is actually kind of hot.
I didn't even want this job. You're the one that talked me into it.
I said 2 sentences. You're that much of a pushover. We should be having sex right now.
And that's the basis for their falling in love. Not with a lie, but with honesty. But there's a problem. Because Guy has to maintain the illusion that he's straight, even with his wife, he and Rick can't be seen together too often. They might be honest with each other, but Guy still has to live a lie so he can keep his job. And for many queer people, that's a dynamic that's pretty relatable. That having to appear straight around other people, for the sake of career, stands in the way of a lot of happy relationships. The central question of Straitjacket is which one is more important to Guy, whether he'll choose love or career. Guy and Rick sneak around to see each other, and they nearly get caught multiple times. And they're really playing with fire, because a government agent has started snooping around the lot. His target? Communists and homosexuals. This is another realistic aspect of queer life back then. For decades, people in the US government actively hunted for communists and gays, in government jobs and in the entertainment industry. Witch hunts that came to be known as the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare. Why those two groups? Well, it was a widely held belief that both groups were subversive, a major threat to the country. Even that gay groups and communist groups were working together to destroy America. In fact, in 1953, President Eisenhower signed an executive order that explicitly declared gay people to be security risks. So-called experts would make wild claims, like you could identify homosexual spies because they had a special way of knotting their neckties, and that they all had a gay little wiggle. Where did that conflation of communists and queers come from? Well, for one thing, because queer people faced so much danger if they were found out, it was believed that enemies of the state could easily blackmail homosexuals, force them to engage in espionage. For another, some prominent queer people were communists and socialists. For example, Harry Hay, an early organizer and the founder of the Radical Fairies, and Bayard Rustin, a close collaborator of Martin Luther King's. But maybe the biggest motivation for the Red and Lavender scares was that gays and communists were both convenient scapegoats. In general, they couldn't defend themselves, because that would require outing themselves and risking terrible repercussions. So conservatives could attack them, and they couldn't fight back. In that climate, it took a lot of effort for queer people to avoid detection, both in real life and for the main characters in Straitjacket. Guy and Rick know they need to be careful, especially because Rick is indeed a communist.
Guy, communism is a reaction to you.
Yeah, I found out. Where did they get off calling it a party?
Guy's rival, Freddie, knows that there's something going on between these two guys, and he tries to get Sally on his side. but she refuses to believe him.
Guy a homosexual? Please, he lifts weights constantly.
But then, one night at a party, Rick and Guy sneak away, Sally goes looking for them, and not only is her fantasy shattered, but Freddy gets another revealing photo. This time, there are too many witnesses to bury the story. It looks like Guy's career is over. He's devastated. Jerry, his agent, can only think of one last-ditch effort to save Guy's career. She finds the government agent and tells him that he can hold a televised hearing at the movie studio. He'll call Guy as a witness, and Guy will testify that he's not gay and the whole thing was a hoax. But in order to sell that lie, Guy will have to identify some gay communists working in Hollywood.
I don't know any gay
I know one.
You are unbelievable.
Being told to name names is another reference to real-life events. As part of the Red and Lavender scares, many people were pressured to avoid persecution themselves by identifying other so-called subversives. For the people who were named, it was disastrous. Many had their careers destroyed, could never work again. It was a grim period. It was dramatized in plays like The Crucible.
Who are they? I want their names.
And on shows like Seinfeld.
They named names.
Okay.
So now Guy faces a terrible choice. Save his career and lose the man he loves, or protect the man he loves and lose everything else.
And Richards, he's such a great writer. The stakes are so high. These two men, they love each other so much, and you see how they could each enrich each other's lives, but there's this big thing separating them, and the big thing separating them is the fucking world, the system that we were in from the 50s until 2016, and maybe even now today.
Still not sure what he'll do, Guy goes to the hearing. And here's where audiences saw the new ending that Richard wrote after so many unsuccessful versions on stage. Guy's called to testify, and he says he wants to provide those names, but not for the reason anyone expected.
In a way, I wish I could give you 10 million names today, because then 10 million people could stop hiding and living in fear, and the rest of you would discover wonderful new sides to people you thought you knew.
But he says he won't do it, because he knows what sort of harm could come to them.
Because the main trait that separates my kind from yours is that we mean you no harm. When you can say the same about yourself, you will have earned the privilege of knowing our names.
To everyone's surprise, he refuses to deny being gay, and he refuses to name anyone. It's very noble, and it looks like he just ended his career. But then Sally jumps up. She's had some time to think, and she doesn't want Guy to come to any harm. She whips up a story on the spot that it was she who arranged for Guy to be photographed in a compromising situation.
I'm a member of a super secret club that turns big Hollywood stars into communists.
And that she was acting under orders from an evil communist saboteur.
He had me trick Guy into falling in love with me, and when he married me, I exposed him as a gay.
And that saboteur, she says, is Freddy, the rival actor who'd been trying to frame Guy all along. It's a shocking twist, but Sally knows that Freddy can't deny it, because she overheard a few things about him when she was still just a secretary.
I'm a card-carrying American, and you can take that to the bank. Well, I joined the party, sure.
The government agent is delighted, Freddy's hauled off, and it looks like Guy can get everything back. His career, and the sham marriage that made it possible. But instead,
I don't think I'll be making any more movies for a while.
He decides to walk away, so he can be with Rick and never have to hide again. And that's how the new ending concludes, with Guy making a clear choice.
Love, choose authenticity. I'm getting emotional because I just love this film, and everybody, you fall in love with the characters, and you so want him to make the right decision at the end.
With filming complete, the work was still far from over. By that point, they were going slightly over budget, with Richard spending more than $500,000 of his own money. And it was far from guaranteed that he'd be able to make it back. The only thing they were sure of was that they were proud of what they'd made. And with that, they started the process of applying to festivals.
It's especially delicious or sweet to go to film festivals with a homemade movie that you or your dear friend made themselves. Because you go like, we made this, and we hung that poster, and we found those costumes.
And because it was made totally independently, the movie could be exactly what they wanted it to be.
And I think that's why it's such a unique movie, because it's made by a smart, talented gay man who had no pressure to do anything but his vision. This movie would not have gotten made by a bigger gay director because he would have had to go, well, but how do I make it more marketable for a straight audience? So when you watch it, you go, this is really for the gays.
And the early response on the festival circuit was promising. I was at one of their first screenings back in 2004, and we weren't the only audience to give it a standing ovation.
When I finally saw it with an all gay audience, and Richard called us up for the Q&A after, the overwhelming love for it was, as close as I've felt to, being a rock star.
As Straight Jacket made the rounds to gay film festivals, audiences went crazy for it. Now, Richard just needed to find a company that would buy the rights, distribute it to theaters, and TV, and video stores. 2 tempting offers emerged from 2 different distributors. One was Strand, a company that was well respected in the industry for handling prestigious films, but didn't have a lot of money to offer. The other was a newer company called Regent. Regent had been formed by 2 guys. One was Paul Kolkman, an executive who had previously worked at Fox, and the other was a Republican tax attorney named Stephen Jarchow. They were in the midst of building a queer media empire. They'd been buying up other companies with plans to launch a gay cable network, and they had more money to offer than Strand. That sounded promising, so Richard took the deal with Regent and waited for Straight Jacket to reach even more audiences. And waited. And waited. Richard expected Regent to give Straight Jacket the usual treatment for an indie film, like a national rollout starting with art theaters in major cities, ads in papers, media interviews, press releases. But when the theatrical release finally came, it was a brief screening as the second half of a double bill at one theater in New York. There were no interviews, barely any marketing. It was bizarre. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, I was waiting too, for Straight Jacket to come out in theaters, or on DVD so I could show it to friends. Around this time, I worked at a video store and kept checking to see if we'd be getting this movie, but it never came in. It wasn't until years later I was able to find a copy, when Netflix still did DVDs by mail. And at that point, it was languishing in complete obscurity. Nobody knew about it. I couldn't figure out why it had just disappeared, and neither could the folks who were involved with it.
I still feel like it should have been more of a cult hit than it was. And it is perplexing to me why it didn't hit that cult status that his other films, like Girls Will Be Girls and stuff.
So, what happened? Well, behind the scenes, things weren't going great at Regent. Kolkman and Jarchow had taken out millions of dollars in loans to fuel the company's growth, and they bought up a lot of other media companies. Soon, there was a tangled web of corporations, subsidiaries, affiliates, real estate. Around 2009, they grew even more when they bought a portfolio of publications that included The Advocate and Out, 2 of the most respected sources of queer news in the country, and also picked up a bunch of adult magazines like Unzipped. But this buying spree was rough. The company was soon reporting major losses. They shut down some divisions, scaled back others, they started taking longer and longer to pay the people working for them, and complaints emerged from filmmakers whose indie films Regent had acquired. Some said they were never paid. Others said Regent sold the rights to their films without telling them. And according to legal filings, Kolkman and Jarchow took in millions of dollars in bank loans that were supposed to go towards releasing movies. But according to the bank, the 2 just created shell companies and sent the money to themselves instead.
They got entangled in all these lawsuits, and they didn't do anything with their properties. And that's where Straight Jacket was for 20 years, lost in that.
But it wasn't alone. From around 2000 to 2010, Regent acquired about 100 films, nearly all of them made by queer artists and dealing with queer themes. And then they did very little with them. Chances are you've probably never heard of most of them, like Beautiful Boxer, a movie about a trans boxer in Thailand. Friends and Family, a comedy about a gay hitman. Looking for Cheyenne, a lesbian love story in France. A series of murder mysteries investigated by a gay detective. Many of those films still aren't available. A whole decade's worth of queer cinema rendered largely invisible. Eventually, the bank that loaned them all that money sued Kolkman and Jarchow for $90 million, accusing them of fraud. Years of court dates and filings followed, and then finally, in 2016, they worked out a settlement while also selling off a bunch of their assets. By then, the damage was done. Not only had those 100 or so films been buried for years, but queer news publications like The Advocate and Out were a shadow of their former selves. Many of their key staff were long gone, and even after Kolkman and Jarchow sold the magazines, financial problems continued. And full disclosure, I was one of the people affected. I freelanced for The Advocate in 2017 to 2019, and there were multiple periods when the owners simply stopped paying me and other writers. They wouldn't respond to invoices or even pick up the phone when we called. When we did get checks, it was often for only a fraction of what we were owed. These days, things seem to have stabilized. The Advocate and Out have new owners. As far as I know, there haven't been any further payment issues. And many, though not all, of the films that Regent acquired are finally available to stream. That long period of instability took a heavy toll on a lot of queer culture and institutions, especially on those filmmakers who poured their heart and soul and savings into work that barely got seen. It's a reminder that even in the age of streaming, when it seems like art and culture should be more accessible than ever, it can still vanish due to ruthless business decisions. And queer media can be especially vulnerable, since the audience can be smaller, word of mouth harder to build. So it's vital to catch it and support it when you can, because you never know when it might not be there anymore. And as for Straight Jacket, Richard took a big gamble on making the film, and this time it didn't pay off.
This was completely self-financed? This was all money out of your own pocket?
It was. And that money stayed out of my pocket, believe me. And I had this money sitting around that I could make a movie with. I understand it's a very privileged position to be in. At least people can take satisfaction in that I did something stupid with it and lost it all.
But that wasn't the end of the story. Around the start of the pandemic, Richard got a call from a man named Marcus, the president of Strand, the distribution company that Regent had outbid years earlier. In the years since, Strand had maintained a laser focus on their specialty, supporting independently produced films. Marcus was interested in a re-release of Girls Will Be Girls since it was coming up on the 20th anniversary. Richard was delighted to hear that. They started working out the details. And that's when Richard checked to see whatever happened to the rights to Straight Jacket. He discovered that, although nobody had told him, they'd reverted back to him. So he asked Marcus if they could make it a double re-release. And Marcus said, sure. That's why now, for the first time, Straight Jacket's available to stream on multiple services, including Canopy, which in many locations is free if you have a library card. Finally, this movie about escaping confines, being liberated, being seen, has been liberated and can be seen, much to the delight of the people who made it.
You know, I did it so long ago, but it remains that thing that I wish more people had seen, only because I just think the movie is so special, and it has this, it's able to comment on the movies of that time and yet say something contemporary. And that is not an easy thing to do.
And watching it now for the first time in nearly 20 years, I still really love this film. For the jokes, the romance, the musical number. But most of all, I love that it's a movie with such a clear point of view, made by someone who had something important to say and who took a big risk to say it.
A very small percentage of people that go into show business end up doing good work. And because of that, and because of all of the bullshit you have to put up with along the way, it's not worth giving up something as big as your essential truth, that you're gay. Like, that is just such an uneven trade that's not worth it. I don't care what career we're talking about.
It's a movie about breaking away from the confines of Hollywood that had to break away from Hollywood to get made. And now that I know everything that Richard and his team went through to make it, I have a new appreciation, especially for the new ending that he wrote, because it's such a clear reflection of how Richard personally had come to feel about Hollywood, and about choosing between career success or living honestly.
It's not that you shouldn't be in the closet. Lots of good reasons to be in the closet. A Hollywood career is not one of them.
Having worked for years on TV shows and films, from big budget studio shows to scrappy independent features, Richard came to a conclusion.
I was furious with the people I worked with, and it kind of came out, but I swear it was their fault, and these movies were a way of just getting that out. Like Girls Will Be Girls is just very violent, and it's got a lot of just darkness in it. But this one, it's a light thing, but it's all about how Hollywood is full of morons, and they're vindictive and horrible, And the only solution is to leave. That's really what it comes down to.
Now, in the 20 years since Straight Jacket came out, the industry has improved. There are more out queer actors, directors, writers, more room for queer stories, and more tolerant audiences. But that didn't happen by itself. It happened because of people pushing for it to get better, from inside the system, to creators working independently outside the system, to audiences demanding better. And to everybody discovering Straight Jacket now for the first time, Richard has a simple message.
Listen, I would just say thank you. If they're seeing my movie, what I have to say to them is thank you, because people do not see that movie.
I want to give a huge thanks to the folks who spoke to me for this video, Richard Day, Carrie Preston, and Jack Plotnick. If you want to see more of my conversations with them, I've posted videos with longer excerpts of our interviews. There's links to those in the description. Check out Carrie's new show, Elsbeth, premiering this February 29 on CBS. You can find Jack Plotnick's comedy videos and his book New Thoughts for Actors at jackplotnick.com, and his film Space Station 76, which was inspired by working on Richard Day's sets. And over on Patreon, I'm posting bonus videos with stories that I just didn't have room for here. That's at patreon.com/mattbaum. Also, if you enjoy my videos, you probably might like my newsletter. Every week, I share stories from behind the scenes of iconic movies and TV shows, and you can sign up for that at mattbaum.com. Big thanks to Ollie and to his colleagues Jesse and Thomas for letting me use their kitchen. Thanks to everybody on Patreon for making my work possible. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm late for the opera.